So today we're going to talk about evil. My name is Darren Gertis. If you don't know me, I am a professor and I've been tracking what's going on in Ukraine since the war began, but on video on YouTube since day 85. We're now 270 days plus in. And it's really amazing to see just the inhumanity that, well, both sides, but primarily the Russians have inflicted upon the Ukrainians. There's some evidence of inhumanity going the other way as well. And I'm really struck by it. So we're going to start here. A couple of days ago, I talked about this with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, talking about how the evil runs through each human heart. It's not so easy to just separate good guys from bad guys, but I made the case that there are some guys that are better than others. Some guys are clearly the good guys here, and if you haven't seen this, please go back and see that. And then I also put out a short the other day, and I'm going to show you a comment. There was somebody who put a comment. I was like, huh? They said, that was me. I said, okay, that was me. What do you mean that was me? So I looked at the short that I put out here.
To date, 400 children have been killed in Ukraine. These are not combatants. These are children. They're civilians. This should never have happened.
Okay.
If you're interested.
So what I said there was that these 400 children plus have been killed to date, and I can't understand how this guy could say that was me. I think he's saying that was me that killed them. Ha 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 ha. Like, what is wrong with somebody that thinks that that's okay, or that that's funny, or that values human life in that way? And this is what we're seeing through this war writ large, as Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist, but just the inhumanity shown to other humans throughout the war. And I'll show you what I mean. Before I do, it reminds me of the god Molech. Molech in the Phoenician and Canaan lands in, say, 2,000 plus 3,000 years ago, was a god that demanded child sacrifices. So take your young, freshly born child and put him in fire, and that pleases this idol. And it's something sinister like that. I don't know how to describe it better than that. And please, I'm not trying to overplay it. There's something very, very evil about what's going on, to what's happening to the Ukrainians at the hands of the Russians. Ukraine says it will look into alleged prisoner shooting video. Now, the Ukrainians aren't without sin on their side as well. There are some things that they have done to Russians that have invaded in the process. There's a video, and I talked about this the other day, a video footage circulated on Russian social media, which Moscow alleges shows the Ukrainian forces killed Russian troops who may have been trying to surrender. I watched the video, and it shows just before, and it shows after. There's a section cut out where whatever was actually happening. And it looks like it may be true. Let's say that it is legitimate, that's shameful, it's wrong, it shouldn't happen. But this tends to be the exception on the Ukrainian side. Not completely. I'm sure there's other abuses. I'm sure we're just not seeing a lot of them. But on the Russian side, it's just abuse after abuse after abuse after abuse. Now, Ola Stefizana, Ukraine's deputy prime minister, said, of course, Ukrainian authorities will investigate this video. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova claimed that the footage shows an execution and wants an international investigation, which is absolutely fascinating. When they called for an investigation after they blew up 50 Ukrainian prisoners at this detention facility back in August, and they called for we want an investigation. But no investigation has taken place. The Red Cross hasn't been in there. And they said it was Ukrainians firing HIMARS to kill these guys when it looks like it was probably blown up from the inside. So there's a terrible hypocrisy here. But let's say this should not happen. Okay, it should not happen. Now, are there abuses? Yes, there are abuses on both sides. There was a fairly even-handed report that came out from the UN the other day. Head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine was saying that they interviewed 159 prisoners of war on the Russian side and 175 prisoners of war held by Ukraine. And what they found was, yeah, both sides have abused. Now, some more than others, right? Let's look at Ukraine's first. So we have credible allegations of summary executions on the battlefield. and ill treatment. We have documented cases of torture and ill treatment, mostly when people were first captured and first interrogated. Russian prisoners of war, they said they were punched and kicked in the face and body. Prisoners were stabbed or given electric shocks. Many reported poor, humiliating treatment. Often naked, they were packed into trucks or minivans with their hands tied behind their backs. We also documented cases of ill treatment of Russian prisoners of war in several pre-trial facilities, including some welcome beatings. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't. I mean, that they need to restrain themselves. I understand emotions are hot. Still, you need to restrain yourself. Of course, the Russians are doing the same kind of things, and in fact, it seems somewhat magnified. Former Ukrainian prisoners of war, immediately upon capture, some were beaten or had their personal belongings pillaged. Hands were tied and eyes covered so tightly with duct tape that it left wounds on their wrists and on their faces. Vast majority of those that we interviewed told us that during their internment they were tortured and ill-treated. Prisoners of war describing being beaten, including with batons, wooden hammers, kicked, given electrical shocks with tasers. A man who was tortured at a penal colony near Olenvinka, that's where that place was blown up that we were just talking about. They said they attached wires to my genitalia and nose and shocked me. They simply had fun, were not interested in my replies to their questions. Others described being stabbed, shot with a stun gun, threatened with mock executions, being hung by the hands or legs and burned with cigarettes. Also documented several forms of violence, including male victim being tied by a rope from his genitalia, and I'm not going to go on with that. So, yeah, it's evil. It's very evil. So it shouldn't happen anywhere. But the lack of perspective about human life is what is really shocking here. The Russian Ministry of Defense talked about this. Now, this is the video. I saw the video on Telegram, and it shows these Russians surrendering here, and then what shows what seems like an aftermath of blood around their heads, like they had just been executed. Now, let's say that that's true. If it is true, it's wrong. Let's call a spade a spade. A barbarous killing of Russian prisoners of war. And by the way, I'm all in for Ukraine. I think that Russia has done very wrong by Ukraine. But let's say that this is wrong if this is what happened. Okay, let's be honest about that. And I know you call them orcs, and I know that you hate that they're in the territory. I believe that they shouldn't be there either. I think it's wrong. But if we're not on the good side, following the rules of war, then you're the same, and you don't want to be that. You don't want to descend into that. Okay, time out. We'll come back. A barbarous killing of Russian prisoners of war, the Russian Defense Ministry said. This is a widespread practice of the Ukrainian armed forces that is actively supported by the Kyiv regime and outright ignored by its Western backers, the ministry stressed. Now, here's the problem that I have with that. One, I don't see it as widespread because I haven't seen other documented cases of anything like that throughout the entire war. We're almost at 9 months. We're 3 days away from 9 months, and I see very, very little of this kind of thing. Two, this particular organization, the Russian Ministry of Defense, lies about things a lot. So it's hard to know when you can believe them or not. But if this is true, it should not happen. Let me continue. No one will be able to portray it as a, quote, tragic exception, except it kind of, where's the other evidence of this happening? That's the key. Amid Kyiv regime's alleged total compliance with the norms of regulating the rights of POWs, the statement noted. But again, when you lie, and then you lie, and then you lie, and then you lie, let's say this is true. I don't know if I can believe you. And that's really the problem with lying. But this shouldn't happen. Let's all agree that this shouldn't happen. Russians accused of burning bodies at Kherson landfill. Now, I was like, whoa, what on earth? But it's not what you think. But it shows the same evil lack of respect for human dignity. The landfill on the edge of Kherson offers some visible hints there and among the piles of rubbish to what locals and workers say happened in the recent past. Every time our army has shelled Russians there, they move the remnants to the landfill and burn them. So they're burning their own Russian soldiers who have died. That's what's going on. I mean, this is the kind of lack of respect and dignity that we're talking about. And the locals are talking about what they've experienced or what they smelled or what they've seen. And then you have at the very end, an intercepted phone call from a Russian soldier in May said that his comrades had been buried in a dump the height of a man just outside occupied Donetsk. There's so much Cargo 200. Cargo 200 is the military code for dead soldiers, that the mountains of corpses there are 2 meters high, he said in the call. It's not a morgue, it's a dump, it's massive. They just toss them there. A Russian soldier said in another intercepted call, and then later it's easier to make it as if they disappeared without a trace. It's easier for them to pretend they're just missing and that's it. This is what I mean by the lack of respect for human dignity. And you just see it again and again. That's evil. It just is evil. Close call. UN watchdog says Ukraine narrowly escaped a disaster after a nuclear plant shelled. And this makes me nervous because if you don't respect human dignity the way that they don't respect them in other cases, they're a lot more likely to have an accident here than otherwise. Otherwise, you would respect it and be very, very careful. Zelensky urged NATO to do something about this. All our nations are interested in not having any dangerous incidents near our nuclear facilities. We need guaranteed protection from Russian sabotage of these nuclear facilities. You also see this in culture. The Russians have destroyed. Now, the Russians have argued that the Nazi regime is what's the problem, and that the people are brothers and sisters with the other Russians, but they don't act like that. What they act like is that they're trying to wipe out any remnant of what is distinctly Ukrainian, including these 800 cultural objects. And this is the least bad thing to my mind, the 800 cultural objects. I'm looking at the human cost. And look at the human cost, like millions of lives under threat in Ukraine this winter. Why? Because these buildings are burned out and they're going to freeze. And who's going to freeze? These women and children that you've targeted for, you've tried to weaponize winter, degrees as low as negative 20 Celsius, -4 Fahrenheit. The WHO has documented 703 attacks on health infrastructure since the beginning of the war. Put simply, this winter will be about survival. So who's going to pay the cost? This little kid. This is not what the good side does. You just don't do that. And then you have things like more than 8,300 civilians killed in Ukraine war, including 437 children. And that's what we know of before we get to the place where all the area is liberated and we're able to actually document what's happened. That's where we are. So there's a reason that NATO just recently, just within the last day or so, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly has adopted a resolution recognizing Russia as a terrorist state. PACE did it. I think Estonia did it. NATO is doing it, and you're going to see a rash of other countries going to be doing it in a while. And they're right, and it's an appropriate thing for them. This adoption of this resolution is an important political step, and therefore influencing the leadership in the countries and other countries' decision making in their parliaments. And I think that's right. And this is because what you've seen, particularly, and both sides are capable of it. Don't fool yourself into thinking Ukrainians are not capable of it. Anybody is capable of it, because as Solzhenitsyn talked about, that line of evil goes through the heart of every man. It's far more one-sided, although it's not purely one-sided, but it's evil. Respecting human life, that dignity is it's just depressing to see. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry if I bummed you out. I just wanted to show you from news events today what was going on and how I was processing and thinking through what's actually the tragic human cost in this war in Ukraine. Thank you for caring about Ukraine enough to listen to me.